My name is Jonathan Neville and I'm talking to you from Australia. This video is about spearfishing and other forms of harvesting marine resources. Now, spearfishing is a popular sport in many countries and it has a lot of supporters. There are clubs, there are spearfishing clubs around the world. They even hold competitions to see who can kill the most fish or kill the biggest fish. Now, I'll start off by saying that spearfishing has some good aspects in terms of harvesting and other forms of collecting, like obviously hand collecting of abalone, hand collecting of crayfish. These are the sort of things that I'm talking about. And just to get the picture straight, I'm going to be clear that these forms of harvesting, although they seem innocuous in themselves, they have led to massive overharvesting of shallow, accessible marine ecosystems around the world. Now, let's think about the good things with hand harvesting, right? So you've got a spear in your hand and you can select the fish you want. You can select the abalone you want to take home or the lobster you want to take home. So the fishing technique, the collecting technique, has no bycatch. And bycatch is one of the biggest problems with many other forms of fishing, particularly commercial fishing. Okay, no bycatch, that's good. You're targeting individually selected animals. Now, another good thing about the sport of spearfishing is that it can be used in different environments. It's mainly used in shallow rocky reef environments because to the general public they're the most accessible. But it can be used to harvest pelagic fish. Now, one reason for its popularity is that humans, I believe, have a deep-seated hunting instinct, and spearfishing provides an outlet for that instinct, if you like, and in a sense that's important. Okay, now let's give you some background. I'm an old man now, but I started spearfishing when I was 12 years old. My family were living beside Port Phillip Bay, and not far from our house there was a rocky breakwater that had been put down to protect the boats in Sandringham Yacht Club. Now, that rocky breakwater provided a lot of habitat for shallow water marine fish that could use crevices, holes, caves in the breakwater for refuge. Now, I made some big mistakes when I was in my teenage years, and I profoundly regret that. I do understand that teenage people, boys and girls, don't necessarily look at the big picture. And I made a lot of mistakes. I paid no attention to the regulations. Now, the regulations that were in place at the time, these are put down by the Victorian state government. They allowed just a certain number of crayfish or abalone and they also specified minimum sizes. Now, those regulations were obviously important and logical. You don't want to harvest an animal before it breeds, so the size regulation is important. And you don't want to harvest too many of them. If you and the rest of the public do that, there won't be any left. Okay, and I completely ignored those regulations, and I'm ashamed to say that. But the regulations meant nothing to me. So I took as many abalone as I wanted, whatever size I wanted. I deeply regret that now. Over the years, I grew up there. I spent many years there. I was very familiar with that marine environment. Over the years, I noticed the fish populations, the abalone populations, crayfish populations going down and down and down. And I realized that I was contributing to that. I was one of the reasons. And of course, if you take major animals like crayfish or abalone or fish themselves out of an ecosystem, you start to undermine the functioning of that ecosystem. And that's exactly what happened. That means me and the other people who were spearfishing there, collecting there, we destroyed that ecosystem. Today, it bears no resemblance to the ecosystem that I grew up with. The ecosystem that I knew as a 12-year-old boy was full of different kinds of fish all over the place. I could go down with my spear gun to that breakwater and I could catch 4 or 5 fish, probably each one a little bit under a kilogram. That was more than enough to feed a family, my family, 2 parents, 3 children, for days. And I could catch those fish in less than half an hour. You can't do that now. A lot of the species that were there once have gone. Now, I'll mention a couple of well-known people who figured in the press around about the time that I was growing up. There was a woman called Valerie Taylor and her husband Ron Taylor. Ron was a bit more interested in photography. Valerie started off being interested in spearfishing. She won awards. She was, I think, the Australian top female spearfisher person more than twice, perhaps several years in a row. Now there was another well-known character called Ben Crop. Now Ben Crop made his name primarily in the early days from harvesting a harmless and defenceless reef shark. That's the eastern coast population of the grey nurse shark. Now back in those days, Ben was proud of what he was doing. You could see him smiling on television. Now both those people have completely changed their view. Valerie Taylor has become a very prominent advocate of marine conservation. It took Ben Crop a bit longer to realise what was going on, but he also became an advocate of marine conservation. Both those people, Valerie Taylor and Ben Crop, became powerful advocates for conservation, not only through their their videos, but also through speaking at public meetings. Okay. Now, I'll also mention one of the things that we did, which we should never have done. Back in those days, there was no regulation against what we call in Australia power heads. In America, they're called bang sticks. They use a rifle cartridge or a shotgun cartridge housed in a container at the end of a spear gun. Now, those devices, on impacting a large animal like a shark, would detonate and kill the animal almost instantly. So, for instance, the slow, defenceless grey nurse sharks, they were almost exterminated from the east coast, and very easily by people using these machines. Thank goodness they're now illegal, but the population, the east coast population of grey nurse sharks, we're talking about Australia of course, is a tiny fraction of what it was. And if their population continues to decline over the way it has in the last half century, they will become extinct. Now, they're protected by law, and the few sites where they can be routinely seen have become tourist attractions. For example, Split Rock off West Head in New South Wales. There's a population of 2 or 3 other places, well-known places on the Byron Bay, on the New South Wales east coast. That's another place where tourists now go just to see remnants of that population, which was once so widespread. It's down in textbooks, in statistics. The grey nurse sharks were the second most heavily harvested population of sharks along the east coast of Australia 100 years ago. Now, you're struggling to find them except at a few well-known places. And talking about Split Rock, the dive operators who take tourists there to see the sharks, these dive operators have been requesting government protection of that area for decades with no success, thanks to minor parties like the Hunters and Shooters Party. In Australia, we have these special interest parties, and some of them have done a lot of good. Some of them, in my opinion, like the Hunters and Shooters Party, has done immense damage. Anyway, that's my opinion. Now, let's just talk about a couple of things about these accessible, shallow water marine environments. One of the most important aspects is that the animals, the fish that have grown up in these environments, they have used the complex rocky structures of their environment for refuge. So for thousands, millions of years, they have grown up in a relatively safe environment. Now, evolution has led to low breeding rates. They don't need to breed fast because their populations were protected by the environment. The grey nurse shark, for example, as I understand the biology, only breeds 1 or 2 pups every 2 or 3 years. Very, very slow compared with, let's say, an ocean-going squid that releases tens of thousands of eggs into the ocean. Now, if you're an ocean-going squid, if you're anything else in the pelagic environment, you need a high-powered strategy, a high-powered reproductive strategy, because almost all of your babies, almost all of your eggs are not going to reach maturity. Now, the safe environment that our reef dwellers were accustomed to for millions of years has gone, and it's gone thanks to humans. After the Second World War, wetsuits became readily available, and diving gear like masks, snorkels, flippers, became cheaply available on the market. The situation changed dramatically. What had been safe environments became dangerous environments. And in many cases around Australia, around the world, over time, spearfishing persons in their pursuit of their sport have destroyed ecosystems, have destroyed local populations. Many of the areas that I used to frequent as a teenager are now devoid of many of the species I'm familiar with. In other words, local extinction has occurred in Australia, all around the world, wherever there are accessible shallow water reefs. Now, the fish you catch in those marine environments are not there anymore because the spearfishermen didn't understand how slowly they bred. I used to go spearfishing at the Flinders Back Beach, not far from Melbourne. Now, there were so many fish hiding in the crevices when we swam down with our spear guns. We'd fire a spear into one fish, it'd come out with 2 fish. Once one of my spears came out with 3 fish. They were that densely packed. If you go back to those crevices, those reefs, those ledges today, there's nothing there. There's no fish, there's no crayfish. They've all been harvested and eaten. What were safe refuges, these crevices, are now traps. Now, it's also a mistake for people like me to believe, oh, it doesn't really matter, if we take all these fish out, they'll be replenished. Now, maybe where are they going to come from? There are no nearby reefs. Oh, I suppose they'll come from deep water. Well, think again. A lot of species have very tightly defined depth ranges. In other words, their habitat does not include the surface down to deep water. They live at specific levels. So in many cases, deep water has not been a habitat that has provided replenishment to shallow water ecosystems. Another thing that's happened too, and this has happened particularly with grouper or groper, as in Australia we call them groper. The fish like groper have breeding aggregations. Now, of course, not only groper, many reef-dwelling fish have breeding aggregations. Now, by and large, governments have failed, and this is not just Australian governments, governments all around the world have failed to protect these breeding aggregations. And of course, from a fisher's point of view, when you get a whole lot of fish together in a breeding aggregation, that is a perfect opportunity to harvest, to over-harvest. And that's what's happened. Some breeding aggregations, probably many breeding aggregations around the world, certainly in Australia, have been eliminated. The aggregations don't occur anymore. Another thing that can go wrong is you can use a spear gun at night. Now, at night, some fish are awake, but many fish are asleep in their crevices. Now, it doesn't take a lot of thought to understand that makes them more vulnerable. Spearfishing at night, in my opinion, should be banned everywhere, all around the world. It's the same as spearfishing on scuba. If you're down at the fish's level, breathing on scuba, it's a very unfair context. Yeah, you can destroy fish easily. You can destroy populations easily if you're night fishing, if you're fishing with scuba. And of course you don't need all these things, as history has shown us, to destroy populations, but the use of night fishing and fishing on scuba is absolutely disastrous, and in my opinion should be banned everywhere around the world. Another thing that you need to remember is that the big females are the best breeders. So the number of eggs a female can produce goes up as the power of 2 or the power of 3 compared to the length of that female. Now, a spear fisherman usually doesn't think about that. They want to take home a big fish because they think, oh, it's a big deal. Somehow their ego gets bolstered if they bring in a big fish. And of course they don't think about the fact that the big females are by far the most important breeders. Again, in my view, big females of any slow reproducing species should be protected by law, not only in Australia, but around the world. Now, an example, there are many examples, and I've told you about my experience on the Victorian coastline. Many of the rocky habitats that I used to fish in when I was a teenager, when I was in my early 20s, they're devoid of fish. Species have entirely disappeared. Now, we're talking about local extinctions here. If we want an example of a total extinction, the California white abalone is an example that's been well documented. Now, what happened there was that as the population of the white abalone went down, the thirst for it on the market increased. So the value, the number of abalone around was going down and down and down, but there was still an incentive for people to harvest them because the price of each abalone was going up. Then, long after fishing should have been stopped by the government, the population was reduced so low that they stopped breeding. That species is ecologically extinct. That's just one species that has been studied, and you can look at scientific papers on the demise of the white abalone. There will be, for sure, many examples of other fish that have been brought close to extinction, or in fact driven over the point into global extinction. I spent nearly a decade as the owner of a cruising yacht. Most of my time was spent in the South Pacific. Now, another really bad aspect of spearfishing is that corporations put together boats crewed with very poorly paid spearfishermen, and they did this because spearfishing was the easiest way to plunder, to harvest the reef habitats in the South Pacific. And many of these boats were operating illegally. They didn't bother to get any sort of national recognition, national permits. They would turn up, particularly in isolated reefs where they knew they weren't being watched by water police. They would unload their crew of professional spearfishermen, and they would go away. They'd put the dead fish in their freezers, and they would go away, leaving a plundered ecosystem. Unfortunately, that happened all across the Pacific. That's it. In the description to this video, I will put a link to a paper which I wrote on this subject, which contains more detailed information. So look, if you're cross with me because of the things I've just said to you, or if you're interested and want to know more, use that link. It will take you to a detailed paper on the impacts of spearfishing. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at the next video.